companies set net zero and other sustainability goals, every department is being tasked with doing their part. But as a non-sustainability professional, what do all these ESG terms actually mean? And what should you do to set yourself and your company up for success? Welcome to the Circular Future, your access to thought leaders and innovations to help you be a business sustainability champion, especially if it's not your core job. I'm your host, Stephanie McLarty, Head of Sustainability at Quantum Lifecycle Partners. Yes, sustainability is no longer just the role of that department. If you're in IT, operations, procurement, finance, you too are expected to know the ESG basics and take action. But it can be confusing. What do terms like net zero, carbon neutral, and carbon credits mean? And what are the differences between scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and now scope 4 emissions? And why does it even matter anyway? This podcast is an excerpt taken from our webinar, ESG101, How to Drive Business Sustainability from Your Role, where we tackled these questions. Have a listen.
Hello and welcome to this webinar on ESG 101, How to Drive Business Sustainability from Your Role. So environmental social governance is the phrase. We often call it ESG to make it short. And the E stands for any of the environmental aspects of a company. We typically focus on carbon because carbon is the issue of our time, but there is something called carbon tunnel vision, in which we can get too distracted on carbon and forget about everything else. And there are lots of other measures under that E. There's waste, there's sustainable procurement, and it's really looking at an organization's habits, operations, and impacts with regards to the environment. Now, for most companies, they start with the E because it is the easiest, the most direct. ESG stands for environmental social governance. The first one being the E of environmental. There is such a thing called carbon tunnel vision, because when we think about the environment, especially applied to companies, we're talking a lot about carbon these days. But carbon is not the only measure or aspect of environmental. We can look at waste, at sustainable procurement, and ultimately it's looking at a company's actual habits, their operations, in terms of how it is impacting the environment. Most companies start with the E of ESG. It's usually the lowest hanging fruit. It's what people can wrap their heads around the most. Perhaps they've already started along that journey. But ultimately, there's still the S and the G, the S being social. And social is looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, or some people pronounce it DEI. But it can also include safety, training aspects. Here at Quantum, we do a lot of focus around safety and training. So we're really focusing around that of social. And also things like community involvement, whether that is employee engagement through volunteering or donations. And finally, the G stands for governance. And it basically looks at how well a company is run, the company's the board representation, the diversity within the board, also things like legal liabilities, human rights, anti-corruption. And for everything in terms of E, S, and G, it will depend on the actual company, what is important to them and what is significant. ESG largely came from the investor community because it was a way for the investor community to wrap their heads around the non-financial aspects of a business. So today, we commonly hear ESG used for companies that are either publicly traded or have investment behind them. Other companies can use the term ESG as well. Another very related term is sustainability. What sustainability means is essentially meeting the needs of today without compromising that of the future. It refers to a company's triple bottom line, which is environmental, social, and financial. So a very related term. There's also the term corporate social responsibility, which hasn't been used as much as it was, say, 10 years ago. It really referred to what companies were doing beyond just simply being a profitable company or striving for profits. And one of the reasons why this term has somewhat faded from use is because it really implies the social aspect. And there's a lot of other aspects, as we know, environment and governance, to look at as well. So that's been a movement towards the term ESG. In some ways, ESG is like CSR 2.0 because it is a lot more prescriptive. And it also implies that you are measuring within the different areas. So it's not just about talking about how we're being good as a company, but that we're measuring it and we're taking action. A couple of other interesting terms are greenwashing and a new one actually that I just learned last week, which is blue washing. Another term for greenwashing is like putting lipstick on a pig. So you don't want to be accused of greenwashing or blue washing. And one of the things you can do is just be very open and transparent around both your wins, the positive aspects, but also the challenges as well. And be ready to defend your actions and what you're saying. Also, GHG, which is a common one. GHG is greenhouse gases, which can also be called emissions, carbon emissions, even carbon footprint. The interesting thing about GHGs is that it's made up of mostly a mix of gases, with carbon dioxide being the most prevalent. You can see on the right-hand side, we've got this little pie chart of the different gases that actually make up GHGs. And you can see that it's about close to 80% carbon dioxide, but there are other gases as part of it. Methane, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases. Methane is really interesting because it's a lot more potent than carbon dioxide. And so ultimately, when we talk about carbon emissions, we're going to talk about them in CO2e. That is the standard metric when we talk about emissions. It stands for carbon dioxide equivalency. And basically, it takes into consideration the fact that it's not just carbon dioxide, it factors in the other gases as well and their potency. And so speaking of emissions, one of the things, if you haven't already seen this, is to be aware of the different scopes of GHGs. The first one is scope 1. This is your direct fuels, your direct use of fossil fuels. So for companies, it's usually your natural gas, it's your the gas or the diesel that's burned through your company fleet, for example. Here at Quantum, we have some big lugger trucks that work at our a couple of our recycling facilities that use dyed diesel. That's included under our scope 1. Scope 2 are the emissions that are generated from your electricity. So any of the electricity that you use for your company, the emissions that are associated with how that electricity is produced gets factored into your scope 2. And for any company, it can be if you're working nationally, you'll see that in the different provinces, the different energy profiles make a significant difference in terms of the electricity emissions, just depending on how much the provincial energy grids use fossil fuels in their electricity. The next one is scope 3. This is your supply chain emissions. And this one becomes a little bit more complex because it's basically looking at all of your indirect sources of emissions that your company is affecting or being affected by. So on the upstream, it's things like your business travel, it's bringing, if you're a product company, it's bringing the products, the raw materials into your facility. On the downstream side, it's taking those finished products and delivering them to your customers, any of those emissions. It's also things like employee commuting. How you get into your company's facility makes a difference, and that's all calculated as part of Scope 3. You can kind of get an understanding now that Scope 3 is really complex. It is something that companies tend to tackle after they do Scope 1 and Scope 2. But for the majority of companies, the majority of their emissions are actually in Scope 3. And that is true here at Quantum. We just did a rough order of magnitude on our Scope 3. And our Scope 3 makes up more than 90% of our emissions. And that is normal. And it really depends on your company. So for a lot of companies, you start with Scope 1 and 2 because it's more within your control, and then you move to Scope 3 and you work on that. And it's a complex undertaking. Also to note, something brand new is Scope 4, which is avoided emissions. And avoided emissions are the emissions that you avoid producing by doing something else. So it's not that you're actually reducing and taking carbon out of the atmosphere, reducing that, you're actually avoiding it in the first place. And now it's got its own category because there's been a lot of gray area in terms of how we calculate avoided emissions. And now it's being parsed out into its own category to work on. So stay tuned for more on that. I spoke about Scope 3 being a really complex issue. One of the things to note is that for companies that are looking at calculating their Scope 3 emissions, their customers' emissions are their Scope 3 emissions. So as an example, one of the large telecom companies that we work with reached out to us just recently and asked us for all of the emissions associated with both reusing, remarketing their product, but also recycling it. So you can start to see, we gave them the breakdown of the emissions that we generate from our process in order to process their materials. You can see that the more that we as a company reduce our emissions, the better it is for our customers. And so it's very interlinked. And if you haven't been asked by your company, by your customers to calculate and give data yet, it's probably coming. One of the reasons for that is because companies are setting ambitious targets. First of all, it's important to look at what these terms actually mean. Carbon neutral means that a company addresses their Scope 1 and they make sure it nets to zero. So they reduce first, and then if there's anything that's left over that they can't reduce, then they probably will offset it. And as long as that number comes down to zero for Scope 1 and Scope 2 combined, then you can call yourself carbon neutral. Under carbon neutral status, Scope 3 is optional. Net zero, on the other hand, means that your Scope 1, 2, and 3 all net out to zero. So net zero is a much more ambitious goal. It is usually something that's a lot longer term. And because Scope 3 is something that you have less control over, it is also a lot more complex. All right, which takes us to carbon credits. As I mentioned about using carbon offsets to reduce your emissions, I want to just point out, first of all, that there are two types of carbon markets. One is the compliance carbon market, which means that it's set up by government regulators and participation is mandatory for these companies that have to participate in the carbon market. And it's things like power generation facilities, refineries. Basically, you will know who you are if you need to participate in the compliance carbon market. On the flip side is the voluntary carbon market. And the voluntary market is really for companies that are voluntarily purchasing offsets to reduce their emissions. Perhaps they've set carbon neutral or net zero goals. And it's not just for companies, even individuals can do this. You may have seen, if you've booked a flight, that you can opt to make your flight carbon neutral and offset the emissions from it. So it's all voluntary. And in order to generate these carbon credits under the voluntary market, you have to meet certain principles, one of which is additionality. The voluntary carbon market is actually growing like a hockey stick. And it's the challenge with the voluntary carbon market too, is that it's often been called like a wild west, in that it lacks the same regulation and rigor. And it's definitely a buyer beware type scenario. So in the voluntary market, which is the most relevant market for most companies, in order to generate carbon credits, you must demonstrate additionality. And additionality basically means that emissions reductions must be above and beyond the current activities to generate a carbon credit. So basically, if the activity would have happened anyways, then it's not eligible for a carbon credit because it's business as usual. So you have to prove that a financial instrument is needed in order to make a project viable, so that it's not already being done. And in order to be done, it has to have a financial input. And the interesting thing about this space is that in order to qualify for additionality, it's not all the same thing everywhere. You have to do this through registries, and the registries themselves are not all the same. They don't all have the same standards or benchmarks. And so what we really advise is to stick with the ones that are globally known to be best in class with the most rigorous standard. And those would be Verra, Gold Standard, American Carbon Registry, and the Climate Action Reserve. It's also important to note that additionality is also not static. So today, you may be able to prove additionality, but 10 years from now, due to things shifting, due to market shifting, new technologies and innovations, a certain practice may become business as usual. At that point, then it no longer meets additionality, and going forward, it would no longer qualify as a carbon credit. So in summary, the thing to know is that for carbon credits, they are always 1 ton of CO2e, but 1 ton of CO2e is not always a carbon credit. And that's a really important distinction when you think about, especially if you're going to pursue carbon credits, carbon offsets, is to do your homework and to ask questions. What we do here at Quantum is, by virtue of recycling and reusing technology, is we know that we do a great thing for the environment. We do not offer carbon credits because we don't believe our space meets that additionality principle. But we do give reporting, and we encourage our clients to use this reporting in their own sustainability reports and their marketing and so forth. And so you can see here on the right, this is an example of our reporting, which shows your reuse on the one side, your recycling on the other, and then the estimated carbon emissions that are saved or avoided through our process. And then we take the time to explain it with you. So if you are a customer of ours and have not yet received this, then please do reach out to us, especially your account manager, because this is something that we can do for you. And if you're new to us, this is a possibility as well. Now, landscape is changing really quickly, and we're now starting to see a double materiality standard emerge. So as I spoke before, it was more single materiality coming the one way, but now double materiality says it's not just about how ESG affects the company, it's how the company affects ESG, the people, the planet too. And so what we're seeing out of Europe is a new corporate sustainability reporting directive that is coming out, and it's not just for publicly traded companies, it is for mid-sized companies and above. For example, if you have 500 employees or a certain revenue threshold, and they will have to report on their ESG as well. And even though that companies aren't actually mandated to report, they haven't been, there's still so many companies that do, and even more that do every year. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why. But the way that they're choosing to do it is by using voluntary reporting frameworks, such as the Global Reporting Initiative, which is the one that we base our impact report off of. There's also the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is actually being rolled into the ISSB going forward. Most companies reference UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are basically the 17 goals that are to create a healthy planet for everyone. And it's possible for companies to reference more than one of reporting frameworks. That actually is very common. The point around reporting on ESG is, choose your framework or how you're going to report, but also be ready to show your work as needed, because there is not a one-size-fits solution for everyone. It really depends on your company in terms of what is significant. However, you should be prepared to basically show your work if people are doing deep dives to prove what you are stating in your reports. Now, why is ESG important for any business and frankly any role in a business? Well, the benefits of ESG are becoming more and more clear, and they are wide-ranging. So the benefits of improving your performance in ESG are in competitive advantage. So especially in your sales and business development, it really can help. We'll talk more about that. It can help you to have better bottom lines because you're essentially reducing cost. And certainly the operations teams, your finance teams will appreciate that. It helps you to manage risk, especially from a leadership level. It helps you to attract and retain talent. And HR departments are really taking note of ESG, and we see it at Quantum as well, that especially for the younger generation, they want to work at companies that have strong ESG mandates. And finally, if you're in the business where you're looking to attract investment, ESG really helps as well. So it really doesn't matter what role that you're in, you are impacted by your ESG performance, and you can have an impact on your ESG performance as well. So let's dive into each of the areas. Number one, there have been many studies that show there is a competitive advantage for those companies that have ESG mandates. And really, this goes back to people want to put their money behind companies and products that match their values and that treat people well. And we've definitely seen there's been an even more of a shift in this since the pandemic. Ultimately, here's an interesting stat: 64% are willing to spend more on sustainable products or services. And we're seeing over time that having an ESG mandate, it's becoming also a business minimum. So just to be competitive, just to be invited to respond to RFPs or RFQs, so requests for proposals or requests for quote, it's a common question now to ask, what are you doing for sustainability or ESG? And you want to have an answer to that. Also, we're seeing that ESG helps to have better bottom lines, because as much as, we can look to add, top line revenue through competitive advantage, we're helping our sales team. Ultimately, ESG also helps to reduce costs because you're looking for efficiencies, particularly around your operations, around your utilities. And the more you can reduce those costs, the better it is for your bottom line. So in most cases, you'll see a lowering of your utility bills. And an interesting case study that we did here at Quantum is that in one of our facilities, we changed over to radiant heating. So it's natural gas-based radiant heaters, and it's a large facility. And we saw our utility bills drop by 25%. The other interesting thing is that it actually made the working environment better for our employees, and they loved it. And so it also had a real boost in terms of employee morale as well. So there's an opportunity where you can do an ESG project that might help you to reduce cost, but can have a positive correlation on your employee experience, employee engagement as well. ESG helps to manage risk. Usually leadership teams are well versed in terms of financial implications and financial risks, but they haven't necessarily looked at the rest of the risks that may affect their business. So what ESG does is essentially creates a dashboard to consider all of the other important factors that may affect your business other than just financial. And now we can actually see too that companies who have stronger ESG mandates are also less scrutinized by the regulators, like the stock exchanges. They receive less pressure from activist groups. And it's because when you voluntarily manage your risk and through ESG and take a really proactive stance on ESG, you're really building trust with your stakeholders, and that pays off. Number 4, the HR side of this, we've touched upon. What's interesting is that 64% of millennials now consider a company's ESG when choosing where to work. We see it all the time at Quantum. And finally, if you are working in a company or space where investment is important, ESG helps you to gain investment. There are a lot of investors, and in fact, studies show close to half of investors now prefer investing in sustainable companies or funds. So it really opens you up to this whole other area of attracting investment for your company. And there is a term for this, it's called impact investing, and there's impact investing exchanges and organizations to get involved with through that. Ways to implement ESG from your role. So at the very basic, it is to get started. Start somewhere. Start looking at what are your company's activities, what are your company's impacts, and what can you do? What can you measure? It could be that you're actually being asked questions by your own stakeholders, or perhaps they're not necessarily asking you these questions, but they're asking you as a collective industry questions, maybe around your carbon emissions. Those are all hints at where you should get started. Another thing is to talk to your own internal stakeholders as well, your own staff, and find out, what are they noticing? What's important? And really, even if, getting started means choosing one thing and starting to work towards it, starting to measure it, starting to make improvements, that is a great place to start. So even the GHG protocol recognizes that this can be a daunting thing to take on, and it is okay to get started with your best available data and information. And then as new data and information becomes available, then to update it and fill in those gaps. If you are ready to take this to the next level, then probably your next step would be to do a materiality assessment. And really, a materiality assessment is a process by which you look at your activities, your operations, your impacts, and you determine out of that what is significant to your business. And so that's what this materiality assessment does. And then from that, it basically ranks all of the different aspects or possible aspects of your business, and you can generate a top 10 list to focus on. We did this last year at Quantum, and it identified the top 10 areas in our planet, in our team, and in our customer groups. We consider those 3 to be our core stakeholders here at Quantum. And it gave us basically, here are the things to focus on and to create a roadmap from. From there, you can then track your progress and set goals. I also want to mention that there are a lot of resources out there that companies may or may not be aware of, and definitely leverage these resources and these organizations to help you out. One would be Green Economy Canada, and they have a boot camp for getting started with ESG. We have worked a lot with Sustainability Leadership, which is one of the hubs of Green Economy Canada, and they have been phenomenal. They've walked us through the process of the materiality assessment. Also, we had HSBC on our podcast a month ago, and HSBC is great because they've come up with a sustainability tracker that is a free assessment tool to basically input the key aspects of your organization, and then it spits out, here are some possibilities to do. They also have a sustainable financing wing now that will fund projects that are ESG related. There's the B Corp assessment. If you've never heard of it, certified B Corps are companies that are for profit and for good, sort of like the fair trade aspect, but applied to companies as a whole. And really a movement to redefine what success is in business. In order to become a B Corp, you first do an assessment. So thank you so much, and all the best to you.
And remember, if you are looking for a partner to help you drive business sustainability, especially in IT, remarketing, and recycling, we'd love to chat. Head on over to quantumlifecycle.com and contact us. This is a Quantum Lifecycle podcast, and the producer is Sanjay Trivedi. Thank you for being a circular future champion in your company and beyond. Logging off.